I grew up in Don Mills, a very middle-class part of the city. Hung out places like Edwards Gardens as a kid, built forts around the kind of train tracks. Did most of my primary school in Don Mills, a little bit of high school, and then moved to Ottawa to finish high school. I was in Toronto the other day, and I was saying to somebody that I used to take the bus to the head of the subway, which was at Eglinton. And then we would take the subway kind of down to Union Station and take a bus to the CNE. That was our big thing. As a pretty young kid, you're not thinking that much about what Canada was like. And Toronto was your neighborhood. So Toronto for me was very much a neighborhood. I had family that kind of lived downtown. My folks' parents, my grandparents, had a shop in Kensington Market. They were immigrants. So they had a fruit and vegetable store like many immigrants. And we would go down there and on weekends. And that was my world in Toronto. My heroes were hockey players and football players. Frank Mahovlich was a hero. Eddie Shack was a hero. I'm dating myself. Bobby Baun and the great Bobby Baun broken ankle story. But I watched a lot of NFL football too. Russ Jackson for the Ottawa Rough Riders. Those were heroes. I never thought about it much, but with the advantage of hindsight, I thought either a left-handed major league pitcher or a fighter pilot were the two things I thought I should have been, but that kind of came to me a little bit later in life. Went to the University of Toronto, did an undergraduate degree in economics, and I went to Queen's and did a master's degree in economics. My first job in the government of Canada was with a subsidiary of the Economic Council of Canada. It was called the Centre for the Study of Inflation and Productivity, and it was the successor to the Anti-Inflation Board. So it had no teeth, but it was monitoring wages and prices after that period where we actually had wage and price controls. That was my first job in the government of Canada. It was the Department of Finance. And I was the analyst writing the monthly memo to the Minister of Finance on the Consumer Price Index. And the very first memo I wrote on the Consumer Price Index was a page and a half. And my boss gave me back 4 pages of comments, mostly red lines, which is where I learned to write properly as a young analyst and where I learned to read improperly. Because to this day, I'm looking for typos and I'm looking for grammar glitches. First thing I look for in any document I read, still to this day. We were kids in many ways still. So work was not a passion at that time. Work was a job. And it was a healthy work and life balance. But you walked among what turned out to be public service giants at that time, guys like Fred Gorbett, who became the Deputy Minister of Finance. You would see an ADM because it was a relatively small department, and you would think, oh my goodness, like here he is right in front of me. But you did your work and you learned. And the more you wanted to take on, the more space there was to take things on. It was a fantastic growing and learning opportunity, but I didn't have passion at that point. It was a job. I think it became about policy first and public service by default, because public service, I was always a policy person. I was never an operational person. And it built over time, but I never articulated it till I actually left government in 1995. So I did a variety of things. I did fiscal policy work, and then I did economic policy work. I worked on the Charlottetown Accord of all things, on economic union. Jocelyn had set up a committee on economic. I had the opportunity to learn amazing things, but to actually not just learn them, but to be part of a conversation about how to advance them. And that was all about public policy and learning and understanding, internalizing, but not really articulating. The 90s, as you know, program review, we had been running large deficits, really built up a lot of debt in the country, and I guess the Wall Street Journal began to refer to us as a little bit of a third world kind of country in that sense. And the Chrétien government found, I guess, they decided it was time to take that on. Large numbers of cuts in public service, large program cuts, really a reorientation of a lot of programming. And again, I was kind of in the middle of that. I worked half-time in the Department of Finance, half-time in the Privy Council office with the folks who were running program review from there. And it was a really interesting time and a really challenging time after years of various attempts at minor expenditure kind of reduction exercises. So there was a lot of tension in the system in '95. The job that I was in was actually eliminated. I don't think I had the full support of my senior leadership at the time to move up. And there was a bit of a pull from the other side because I'd always wanted to try the private sector. So things came together and it was an opportunity to leave. And I really pretty much jumped into the first thing that opened for me, which was a job with one of the professional services firms. So this was when when interest in public policy turned into passion. I walk in the door of this professional services firm and I meet a very senior partner, and the partner introduces himself to me and says, welcome, and what do you do? He says, I do business process reengineering. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know what that is. And he says, what do you do? And I say, well, I do public policy. And he says, yeah, we don't do that here. And he turns on his heels and walks away. And I realized what I had walked away from, but I wasn't ready to turn around and go back. I wanted to explore it, which is what I did for the next 3 years. So just to step back a little bit, my career was really very much a series of fortunate accidents. Timing just happened to be there and supply and demand kind of came together. So I came back. I left government as a DG, as an EX3. I came back as an assistant secretary in the Privy Council office, the liaison secretariat for macro policy, so basically chief economist to the Prime Minister. A big interface with the Department of Finance, so I knew the Department of Finance. And I knew the Privy Council office somewhat from having worked on program review. And if public policy had been a great interest and public service had become a passion, then the center was sort of where I belonged. I must have spent 22 years in central agencies between finance and Privy Council office and Treasury Board. And they suit me better than they might suit other people because I tend to I look at issues from a framing and a strategy perspective. The ability for those organizations to convene and to collaborate, there's a certain authority that goes with those central agencies that allows for that. And that was really where I found that nexus of interests around policymaking and advice, providing advice, was being able to convene those groups. Yeah, I think policy is the solution to a particular problem. So there's not a lot of point in developing a policy if you're not trying to fix a problem. Although I think there have been times in our past where we've actually developed solutions that aren't really looking for problems. And advice is, if there's really a core function of the public service on the policy side, it is providing advice to decision makers, to our political decision makers. It was pretty straightforward for me. The clerk of the Privy Council at the time walked down that long hallway from his office to my office, shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, you're the new Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet Plans." And I looked up and said, "Me? You're talking to me?" And so that cost me a very large box of Smarties and a bottle of scotch. And I was it was nothing I ever anticipated or expected, but that's how it happens. It wasn't a phone call. It was the clerk came down and said, "You're the one." Yeah, well, first things first, that position was not really a deputy head, not in the context of the FAA. So that belonged to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. I brought a central agency perspective on solutions and framing and strategy to the job. And I think I also brought a perspective around speed. Because the central agencies were often about speed. So you not only had to be kind of right, but you had to be fast. And I wouldn't say that sat perfectly well with my new organization. But they were a really capable, smart group of people. We had a mandate from Paul Martin to put together an international commerce strategy. And I think we really stretched the parameters of that exercise. So we had a lot of fun. I thought we put together a fantastic document. But I was only in the department for about 2 years, so we didn't really see the implementation side of that. Timeout was, I won't say that it was life-changing, but it was a real wake-up call. Because sometimes we don't really know ourselves very well. And sometimes you need somebody else to tell you who you are in the context of the world that you're actually working in. And that's what happened to me. So I'd made it a long way through my career until somebody finally kind of said, you have to fix these parts of who you are or how you behave in the public service. And that was a really difficult time. I went off to the Treasury Board Secretariat for 1.5 years. I thought that would be a great way to end my career. I was comfortable in the central agency, and that lasted 1.5 years. And then came the next chapter. I think patience, providing space for people to come to the right conclusions. It was a very complicated organization. It's a shared space, as you know, with the Chief of Defense Staff. It's a massive department. And I really had to step back from, you have to trust your ADMs and your generals in that organization. So I would say patience and calm and letting people figure out the right solutions, keeping them inside guardrails or helping them stay inside guardrails. Really tricky space, but I loved the job. It was a fantastic job. That's a great question. I think I probably break away a little bit from what my colleagues or former colleagues would say. And I never questioned myself about leadership. I never thought about who I was as leader until I was stood up and sort of given a timeout. I always felt I had what I needed to be a leader no matter what level I was at, from the time I was an EC5 to the time I was a deputy. And all the way through, it was a question of taking the space that was provided to you and working in that space to bring people together to find solutions to problems. And for me, that was leadership. Well, let me just take you back a second to when I left government, because the learning that went on in the private sector allowed me to come back and put some of that thinking on the table in the public service in a way that most of my colleagues couldn't, because they didn't have the experience. I think there is a big difference in leadership between public sector and private sector, and I think that's because of what you are mandated to do, what you are responsible for in the public sector. Private sector companies, bad leadership, stock prices fall, private sector companies go bankrupt, resources get reallocated. Public sector, they don't go bankrupt per se, countries fail. And so the responsibilities of leadership in the public sector are much more profound in my view than in the private sector. Would it be better if they had jobs outside the public service? I would say probably, yeah. It's just a diversity in terms of how they think. It doesn't have to be private sector. It could be kind of academic, it could be private sector, it could be not-for-profit. But I think the bigger issue is we talk about recruiting the best and the brightest. So we recruit the best and the brightest, and then we put them in chairs and we say, we'll see you in 10 years. And, we pour water on them and watch them sort of grow over time, but we don't proactively grow them. And so I've talked about that in the past, and I'm away from the system now, so maybe it's happening in a more deliberate way, but it wasn't when I was there. Oh boy. I get a lot of, you were really frank, which meant I was I came across, I think, as often fairly aggressive. I think people thought that I was able to frame things. I had a pretty good sense of where I thought the center of the road was, but I didn't necessarily give everybody time and space to get them to the center of the road. So I was probably a little too anxious to get there. And that can be hard on people. And I think a lot of people would say that, I was kind of hard on them in terms of pushing towards a solution. So at the moment of the tragedy, I was in my office, in the Privy Council office. I was Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet Plans. The clerk called the DepSecs to his office, and we watched in horror, really, as those airplanes over and over, watching them hit those towers. We had a crisis on our hands of enormous proportions, almost undefinable. You know the story of the landing of the planes and the closing of the airspace. But we had borders that were basically shot in 14-hour lineups at the Windsor-Detroit border, and the Americans had gone 100% onto security, and we were still in this world of a balance between economic and security. So that became the challenge of the moment. So I took on an added title, an added job. Mr. Chrétien asked Mr. Manley to be the counterpart to Tom Ridge in the United States to negotiate a border agreement, which was a multifaceted agreement. And Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, I think at the time, Manley, asked the Prime Minister if I would also be his deputy. So I was the deputy on the Smart Border Accords, which meant working across 15 different organizations, working with the White House, pulling together an agenda, negotiating the details of that agenda. And by December of that year, we actually were at a signing ceremony in Detroit with Prime Minister Chrétien and President Bush to sign off on I think a 36-item Smart Border Accord. We had a fantastic staff. Graham Flack, former colleague of ours, was the sort of lead for me on that. And we had a bunch of really smart, kind of young team members. It was a tragedy, but it was an amazing opportunity to actually advance an agenda that badly needed advancing. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, I've thought about this, I wrote a little bit about this, a really interesting trajectory. And knowing that I would be doing this, I thought about where did I end my thinking about this and where are we a little bit today. I think the public service I entered was a very ordered, very structured place. Again, on policy issues, the public service kind of didn't own the space, but had access to the resources required to do good, thoughtful policy, take the time to do it, and manage the stakeholders and get to advice giving and get to decision making, get a decision, get to implementation. And if there was a problem or a mistake, it would come out in the print media, a month later, and by then you'd be on to the next thing. By the time I had left government, that had changed dramatically as a result of where just information communications technologies had taken the world. Everybody with smartphones could do policy advice. Government had to respond to many, many voices. The speed with which you had to do your work, your policy work, get to advice, get to a decision, had collapsed in many ways. Many, many more voices out there because everybody had access to the resources they needed to do policy work. So it was a very, very different world. And I think it put very different kinds of demands on the public service. I wondered whether the way that we practice Westminster parliamentary, or whether our institutions are actually fit to purpose today, given the sort of continuous evolution of that. So a very different world that I left than the one I started. I suspect a very different world today than the one I left. There were some ministers I liked and some ministers I didn't like. I always treated my ministers with the utmost respect. Didn't matter who they were. Often to this day, I have to catch myself calling former ministers still, as opposed to kind of by their first names. I was not good at managing my minister per se. I managed my minister like I managed my public service life. There was the answer, let's go minister, but we would have debates. Some, I think, appreciated that approach more than others. But ministers, for me, they deserved the utmost respect for the positions that they held and the decisions that they had to take, both collectively and individually. The entire uniformed community, the military are remarkable people. The things they're trained to do, the way they're trained to do it, how they go through continuous training throughout their careers. They're a remarkable group of people, and I spent time with them around the world, including in Afghanistan a number of times, and they really put their lives on the line. And as you know, 158 of them, 157 of them did during the Afghanistan war, which was tragic. Generals are an interesting group of people. There are many of them over at National Defense Headquarters. And so you don't realize just how much status they have because there are many of them around. Extremely smart, engaged people, worried and concerned about the troops that they actually command and the commands that they actually have. From time to time, I think they drift outside of their swim lanes a little bit and into kind of civilian swim lanes. And that's why that space is so complicated, not just between the deputy and the chief of defense staff and his or her staff, but also between the deputy and the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, the security community, and the Canadian Armed Forces. Very, very complicated space, but there is no other way to learn about them the way I did, no other opportunity except to be with them. It was a great experience. I think the first part of the answer to that question is my wisdom is out of date. There's a different normal. And I still spend a lot of time with fairly young public servants and some aspiring public servants, including mentoring kids from university. Their normal is very different than the normal that I left with in 2014. I think my answer would be understand what the institution is fundamentally about and what it's responsible and accountable for, whether you're doing operations, whether you're doing communications, whether you're doing policy work. Take as much of it as you can and internalize it, and think about why you're doing it and whether you're passionate about it. Because if you're not, you may as well be somewhere else. I think that's probably what I would say, but we're living in a different normal than the one I grew up in.